I remember when I was probably 3.5, a little bit more, my mother took me to the famous Novodevichy cemetery, where all the dignitaries of the arts put to rest. And I said, well, why are we going there? Or who are we seeing? And then she said, well, we're going to see your father's grave. When he passed away, they took me to a friend's house, and they wouldn't tell me for quite some time. That trauma was probably the most significant trauma I've ever had. And I remember distinctly that I thought to myself, my life will never be the same as I've known it. It certainly wasn't. I'm Dmitry Sitkovetsky, violinist, transcriber, conductor, educator. I was born a long time ago, 70 years ago, in Baku, which was USSR at that point. And since then, I've lived a life of a musician. Life of the musician is a different life from, I would think, any profession, because basically all waking hours, there is music going on through my head. Sometimes it's just something I'd remembered or heard of or just practiced, which means played the violin, or heard even on the radio. So one is never completely out of the world of music, which I believe is much more of a blessing than a curse. Because when you have this alternative universe, much better universe than the one we live in, that's an instant escape. There is logic, there's fantastic discipline, no violence, rhyme and reason, harmony, and beautiful sound. And it doesn't take a big effort. All I need is either be inside of my head or just look at the piece of music. And I'm there. I don't remember ever having a day in my life without a sound of music. The very first memory, I think, is not a conscious memory. I was on stage, still in my mother's womb, because she played until I was probably 7 months inside of her. And apparently I got very excited about Beethoven Concerto No. 1 for piano. And there is a place there in the last movement, which is kind of lighthearted. And I got to be so active that her piano had to be moved away from her. And then after that, she decided this is probably the time to stop performing. So I responded to this particular piece of music while in the womb. Of course, I must have been given violin to play, to tune it, which is always a big thing, because to tune a violin for a little kid is almost mission impossible. And I often feel bad for non-musical families. They cannot help the little one to tune it, because it's very difficult. Those pegs and everything goes out of tune. There's all kinds of little machines that hold the tuning. So all of that came rather easy to me because I was surrounded by people who were musical. In Russia, there were several groups. I belonged to one where it was the dynasties, the musical dynasties. We were the children of. My mother, Bella Davidovich, is certainly one of the most gifted pianist, certainly of the last century, and one of the greatest Chopin interpreters ever, I think. My grandmother was fantastic piano coach in the opera house, and she was probably even better sight reader than my mother. And not only the piano side on my mother's side, but also violin. My uncle was a violist, but my grandfather, my father's father, was a very good violin pedagogue, the one who must have started with me. There was so much sound in my household. First, it was my father, whose last performance in Moscow happened to be Shostakovich's first violin concerto. And he was learning this concerto, and apparently I was always able to distinguish that piece of music from anything else that he played. My mother practiced her recital and concerto repertoire, and sometimes her student would come in, and other musicians would come in and play. I did feel that, that I was born into an aristocrat class of musicians. No question that I was very privileged to have been growing up in Moscow. I was only born in Baku. I was there 5 weeks and then visiting, my grandparents. We lived in a lovely apartment in a good area. It was 45 minutes by metro, including the walking. It wasn't that far. I remember, for instance, that I would not have to buy a ticket to a concert, or sometimes even to certain theaters, because they always, Dimichka, of course, come. So that's a privilege. And also, just the proximity to those great names. When David Oistrakh played with my mother, or Daniil Shafran would come over and rehearse, or the other people, could only see them from the stage. So that's also an advantage. My mother was incredibly gifted. According to family legend, she came up to the piano having heard a Chopin valse at the age of 3 and started playing in the right key the same Chopin valse. I mean, she was an extraordinary wunderkind, really. I grew up under Bela Davidovich's piano. I took it for granted, of course, because it was always there. I only appreciated it much later in life because my idea of being a professional musician, what it takes and what it entails and what you have to do, was based on my mother. She never really practiced endless hours, but she practiced in a particular way and very effectively. She was never late in her life, and she was never less than 150% prepared in every way. And also, she was incredibly vivacious. She was always very popular among her colleagues, and knowing, her sense of humor and lightness of being. But as a mother, she was, later on, she was anything but light. There was another side of her. And that's the side only the family really knew. Well, the home atmosphere was very much affected by such early death of my father. He died when he was only 32 years old. After his last Moscow performance of the Shostakovich first violin concerto, he had another tour, recital tour. And after that, he was in the hospital for practically a year. And only for a month before his death, they brought him home basically to die because they could not figure out what to do with his lung cancer. He was in the bedroom. He couldn't walk or anything. He was just basically there. And occasionally I would come in and see him. But there was a bit of a fear because a year before he wasn't there. And then he disappeared. I suppose a few months, maybe even 6 months after he passed away, could have been even more, because it must have taken at least a year to have the tombstone at Novodevichy Cemetery. So my mother took me to that cemetery at some point. That's what I remember. I thought to myself, my life will never be the same as I've known it. It certainly wasn't. Because all my life, the shadow of my father, looking up to his extraordinary talent, which I knew, of course, through the recordings, or the incredible stories that I heard about him from many people that I trust, that was something that I've always measured myself against. And I still do. His was an interesting character because what I heard when he was quite young, maybe just 10 years old, still in Kiev before his family moved to Moscow. And he played for great French violinist Jacques Thibault, who came to Kiev. And Jacques Thibault was very impressed with the way my father played and said, young boy, you should learn foreign languages besides Russian, because you're going to be having a big career and you'll go different countries, so you'll need to communicate with different people, to which my father answered, but Monsieur Thibault, whatever he called them, but if they want to communicate with me, they should learn Russian. So, which was, of course, from his point of view, quite logical. So she took me to that cemetery. So that was a big shock. I basically understood at that point, probably first emotionally rather than mentally, I understood that my back will never be protected. Basically, I was protected by impractical terms. But in terms of father figure, which is, I remember later on, Julia, my daughter, I could never experience what she especially valued when she would just, little girl, I don't know, 2, 3, and she would, touch my legs, or just steady, strong. That physical protection plays a big, big, big role in little kids. We need that father or mother figure, but my mother was absent most of the time, because for her to deal with this situation when she became a widow before she reached 30 years of age, she has a very sort of black and white choice, either to get married again, to remarry and give up part of her activity as an artist, or take sort of the father function as it used to be, certainly in those days, is to be the provider. And she certainly, without any doubt, she was not made really to be just a mother figure. She was first and foremost an artist. And it was never a question of whether she would just give that up and become a mother who would, take care of my needs. I had a nanny for that, and she earned enough money to pay for everything, for my nanny and everything, and which was great. But sort of the parental input in my life, I only got from my nanny. My mother did set very, very high standards without ever talking about it. She never taught me directly anything. She was just there. She would appear and then disappear. I thought that's what everybody should be like. And I should be like this if I had any chance to become a professional musician. Little did I know that some of the biggest names in the business were not like this at all. And that came as a surprise later on. But her presence was fleeting but incredibly impressive, I guess, which I resented later on as I was growing into my teens. Most of the time she was on tour or practicing for an important concert or teaching at Moscow Conservatory or entertaining friends, sometimes in our apartment, but often elsewhere. She led a very active social life, and we had wonderful friends in the theater world, in the opera world, in the ballet world, all kinds of, intelligentsia. It was very, very much her and my way of communicating, because in our house, great chess players were always there. I grew up among some of the best, most famous chess champions of the world, like Mikhail Tal, who was the youngest at that time, the youngest world champion at the age of 23. And apparently, by that time, my mother was a widow, and he was trying to get her interested to marry him. There's a good story when he was about to play his most important match for the world champion against Botvinnik, Mikhail Botvinnik, who was a long-time world champion. And he asked my mother, he used to call her not Bella, but Bellissima. So he said, Bellissima, do you know Elegy by Rachmaninoff? I want you to play it when I beat Botvinnik at the end of the match. I mean, before the match, he's asking, but he was so sure. He said, no, I never played that piece, but I could certainly learn it. But listen, Misha, that was his nickname, first win the match and then we'll see. And so throughout the match, he would call her halfway through or something, said, Bellissima, have you learned the Rachmaninoff elegy? Said, don't worry about it, I will, but it's not over yet. We don't know. Said, just learn it. And he did win it. So she was away. And I don't remember, as I said, even class, in Central Music School, just like in every other school, there were parental meetings. Very rarely my mother came there. My aunt would come, my nanny sometimes would come. So she was not really that involved in my sort of everyday life. However, whenever there was something professional involved, she was always there. She did take me to my violin teacher at the age of 5, I was, and she wanted him to take me. And he said, Bella, the son of Julian Sitkovetsky, who was gone already, of course, by the time I was 5, might not be such a great idea for him to become a violinist. He suggested that he'd give me to one of his assistants for 6 months and then see if it's really worth it for me to study, because he said, and he was absolutely right, said to be the son of Julian Sitkovetsky would be a big burden for him unless he has a special talent, which I will only be able to see maybe in 6 months. So that's what they did. And then Yuri Isayevich Yakilevich listened to me. And then he said to my mom, no, he won't be probably such an extraordinary virtuoso as his father, because that you have to be born to be that way. But he's got something else, and I'm taking him. So that's how my fate was sealed, at least for a while. So it was very early on. I felt that I had to compete and prove, which I wasn't always sure whether I was up to that task, until I won that first prize at 12. And then all of a sudden I became the violinist to beat. So this is it for this chapter. And I'm Dmitry Sitkovetsky, and you're listening to Keeping the Flame, produced by Libo Studio. So the next time, I will tell you all about the so-called Great Russian Violin School. What is that system that produced such great talents, why it worked, and how it shaped me in so many ways.